The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, how New York made voting rights history, plus the movement to give workers a say in how their companies are run. And Bill Press talks with national politics reporter Hanna Trudo on the Democrats lining up for 2020 and why Howard Schultz is making everyone so mad. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The state of New York is moving on a series of bills that will fundamentally change the way New York residents vote. Julie Kerr is an activist fighting for voting reform, and she says the latest victory was decades in the making. And we say hello to Julie Kerr. She's an activist with Let New York Vote, which is a nonpartisan statewide coalition working to improve elections. Julie Kerr, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. The voting reforms passed by the New York legislature last week represent a significant victory for your organization. Can you walk us through exactly what got accomplished?
Yeah, it was very exciting, especially since the state legislature made it its first priority when they started the session this month. There were 6 bills that were passed. Early voting. We've consolidated our primaries. Previously, we held our federal and our state primaries on 2 different days. The state legislature passed same-day registration, as well as pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, portable registration, and then finally, no excuse absentee voting. No doubt these accomplishments took some years of organizing. Can you tell us kind of what type of effort went into this campaign? It was very exciting. As you mentioned at the beginning, I'm an activist. The coalition itself, Let New York Vote, began almost 2 years ago, and it's a grassroots effort. It's a grass tops effort, meaning there are good government groups, social justice groups, unions, civil rights organizations who have been fighting on these measures for years and in some cases decades. Who really laid a great foundation for a broader grassroots effort in all of this as well. And so almost 2 years ago, a bunch of people who really wanted to make this an issue throughout the state and seeing the energy that was happening in late 2016 and early 2017 kind of met and talked about the issues and really identified the need to engage people throughout the state to make this a priority to happen. And so from that, we came up with the coalition, created a website, created toolkits, basically to give people the information and the facts and the resources they need to go out into their own communities throughout the state, bring the topic to the forefront, and engage people in their own communities to educate everyone on why these reforms are so necessary in the state and just how far behind New York was lagging in its election laws and voting laws. You mentioned the toolkits, and you have those on your website. Is that just for anybody if you want to get involved and you want to start getting into the organization, this kind of thing, that they can just jump in? So the Let New York Vote website, which is letnyvote.org, has all kinds of information and facts and toolkits and stories about just how far behind New York has been in the voting reform process for the last decade. The reforms that were passed last week were really the first significant voting reforms passed in the state in more than a century. So anyone can go to the website and find our toolkits and use it to educate themselves and go out into their own communities and inform the people within the state of just why these reforms are so important and how they will improve the accessibility and the equitable voting process within the state. You can also, we have a very robust grassroots network, and you can join email groups and Google groups and calls where we touch base with each other and find out, what everyone's hearing from the representatives or how people in their communities are reacting when they hold forums or just talk to people about the issues. And the whole idea is really it's a statewide issue. And while certain issues may be different from different parts of the state, ultimately, we all need to participate in our democracy. And to do that, we need our voting laws modernized.
Absolutely. And what I think is great is that wherever you are in the country, you can go to letnyvote.org and you can take a look at these toolkits. You can, every state's going to have their different things going on, but voting reform is needed across the board. So if you want to get involved, it's a great way to get started. Now, Julie, before we go any further, passing the reforms, that's one thing. Making them work is another. So what needs to happen to make for the most effective rollout of these reforms?
The biggest thing that needs to happen is they need to be funded by the state government. The Governor Cuomo, proposed his state budget last week as well, and he did include early voting, electronic poll books, and some other reforms in his budget, which is all fantastic. But he did not propose specific funding for those reforms. So for these to really work and to succeed and to really modernize the way New York votes, the state needs to be able to chip in and help the counties with the funding so that there is as seamless as possible a rollout of many of these reforms. So one of the things that Let New York Vote will be doing over the next couple months as the budgets continue to be proposed by the legislature and negotiations begin, is to continue to pressure our lawmakers and ask communities to contact their lawmakers to make sure that these reforms are funded adequately in the state budget so that they are set up to succeed.
We're speaking with Julie Kerr, an activist with Let New York Vote, which is a nonpartisan statewide coalition working to improve elections, and they're starting to see some success. I can't imagine Let New York Vote is going to stop. So what other voting reforms do you hope to see adopted by the state legislature?
You are absolutely correct. What happened last week is merely a first step in some of the reforms that we need to see. There are several different reforms that we hope to see going forward, still in this legislative session. Among them are automatic voter registration. 17 states in the country and the District of Columbia offer automatic voter registration. We would like to see New York be number 18. We need to permanently restore voting rights to people on parole. The governor wisely issued an executive order last spring granting conditional pardons to allow people on parole to vote, but we need to make sure that is codified into legislation to make that permanent. New York has a terrible, terrible deadline for changing your party affiliation. We are a closed primary state, and for instance, if you're going to vote in a primary this year, if you want to change your party registration, or if you're an independent who wishes to vote in the primary and you need to declare your party registration, currently the deadline for making that change was October of last year. So we need that deadline to change and to be much more flexible for people to make their decisions closer to the primary dates. We need a voter-friendly ballot initiative legislation passed for readable and well-designed ballots. And finally, I mentioned before electronic poll books. This is an important piece of legislation that will really help significantly with facilitating early voting. So it's important to see all 5 of those things pass this year as well.
And Julie, before we let you go, in thinking about why you do this work, how will a better voting system and more people voting, how will that make a difference in New York?
It will make a huge difference. New York right now has some of the worst voter turnout in the country. In the 2016 presidential election, we were 41st. In the 2014 midterms, we were 48th in voter turnout. Our numbers improved significantly this past year for the 2018 midterms. So that is great in terms of the amount of voter turnout. But our ranking countrywide is still pretty poor. So these reforms are about removing barriers for eligible New Yorkers to participate in our democracy. It's about making registering and voting more accessible and equitable for every eligible New Yorker, and by allowing people to engage in the system, it only creates a stronger state for everyone here.
Well, and I think it's wonderful work that you're doing. Julie Kerr, again, an activist with Let New York Vote, which is a nonpartisan statewide coalition working to improve elections, joining us here today on America's Democrats podcast. One more time, you can go to letnyvote.org and learn more about it and learn how you might be able to take this into your own community and bring necessary voting reforms to where you live. Julie, thank you so much for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much. This was great.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, can worker participation on corporate boards fight income inequality? First, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The rich aren't merely different from you and me. They're ridiculous. The uber-rich, the billionaire barons of Wall Street who literally live above the real world and are clueless about the gross inequality their financial schemes are creating. Take Kenneth Griffin, a hedge fund tycoon who's the latest gold medal champion of conspicuous consumption. He just paid an obscene $238 million for a sprawling 24,000-square-foot New York City penthouse located 79 stories above street level at Central Park South. A strip nicknamed Billionaire's Row. His 3-floor mansion in the sky is the most expensive residential purchase in U.S. history, exceeding the excesses of robber barons in the Gilded Age. Adding to the overindulgence, he'll live there only occasionally, for he also has a $60 million penthouse in Miami, a $122 million mansion in London, and posh crash pads elsewhere. Griffin is the poster child for that disgraceful Trump GOP tax cut for the super-rich, which they passed by claiming that beneficiaries like Ken would put their windfall into jobs and wage increases for the working class. Interestingly, his exclusive skyscraper residence replaces a modest 20-story building of affordable rent-controlled apartments where dozens of middle-class tenants lived. They were evicted by the corporate developers to provide opulent digs for a few billionaires. That ought to be illegal, but instead, a state law specifically empowers landlords to toss out middle-class and low-income tenants, demolish their apartments, and put up a swank new building. If you wonder where inequality and America's affordable housing crisis comes from, there it is. This is Jim Hightower saying, yet Griffin complains that he has, quote, insufficient influence in politics. Really? Who had the political clout to eject those families from their homes?
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. What would happen if employees had a direct say and democratic say in how their companies are run? Reporter Glenn Daigon says it's an idea that's gaining support. And we say hello to Glenn Daigon, a journalist with the news site Who, What, Why. Glenn Daigon, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. You just wrote a great explainer on the idea of worker participation on corporate boards, and it's called co-determination. Tell us how that works.
Well, co-determination is a system that allows employees at large corporations to elect members on the corporate board of directors. The idea is to broaden a corporation's base of stakeholders from just top management and shareholders and to include rank-and-file workers as stakeholders as well. Another driving force behind co-determination is that by including workers on corporate boards, they will serve as a needed check and balance on the power of capital and top management.
So the idea is seen by supporters as a significant way to battle inequality in the United States. How would that play out? Well,
advocates note, and they cite the following fact, that over the last decade, big American companies have dedicated 93% of their earnings to shareholders, effectively redirecting trillions of dollars that could have gone to workers or long-term investments in those corporations. And because over 80% of the value of stock is owned by only 10% of the population, with over half of Americans owning no stock at all, what this proponents claim that this tunnel vision dedication to short-term shareholder return has accelerated the trend toward inequality since, again, a relatively small percentage of the population owns stock.
And I imagine if not for the 401k, that number would be a lot smaller, too.
Yes, it would be.
Yeah.
It would be.
You report that this is happening in countries such as Germany and Scandinavia. What's your sense of the impact in those countries?
Advocates who support co-determination point out that these countries, such as Germany and Scandinavia, have at least as good a growth rate as the U.S., and in some cases a higher growth rate than the U.S., without anywhere near the levels of income inequality that the U.S. has. They believe that co-determination is a big reason for this. For example, one statistic cited, they cite the fact that in Germany, income differentials between CEOs and rank-and-file workers are much, much smaller than in the U.S., and they directly attribute this to having employees, representatives on the corporate boards.
It may surprise some of our listeners that legislation has been introduced in Congress to act on this idea. It's called the Accountable Capitalism Act and was introduced by Senator Warren. What would it require?
Well, the first thing it would do, it would apply to companies with over $1 billion in revenue. And for these companies, these big companies, instead of being a license to do business by each individual state, they would be granted one federal corporate charter through a new Office of United States Corporations in the Commerce Department. And the key thing here is this charter could be revoked if corporations were not to follow its rules, including engaging in repeated and egregious illegal conduct. The other thing, as we mentioned, is employees would have a chance to elect worker representatives on the company board of directors. This legislation would specifically set aside 40% of all corporate directors on these billion-dollar-plus companies to be elected by workers. The other thing is under this Accountable Capitalism Act, is executives who receive shares of stock as compensation would have to hold them for at least 5 years. The idea behind this measure is to ensure that decision makers focus on long-term interests of all corporate stakeholders rather than enriching themselves on the basis of short-term gains in companies' share prices. And the other thing is, the other big thing, is that board members and shareholders under this legislation would have to approve all spending, all political spending.
We're speaking with Glenn Daigon, a journalist with the news site Who, What, Why, talking about worker participation on corporate boards. It's called co-determination. Now, of course, Glenn, just like with anything, this idea not without criticism. Some argue it would prevent companies from being able to respond to the marketplace. Is this a reasonable criticism?
For my article, one of the front and central examples that critics use, they call it the Steve Jobs argument. And what they say is that Steve Jobs in 1996 had to really, when he was back in the saddle in Apple, really had to bust heads and name names to turn the company around. By that, he had to shut down a lot of unproductive units. He had to get rid of what some would say was dead wood on the board of directors. And, it's reminiscent of the saying you have to break eggs to make omelets. What critics say is co-determination, if co-determination be the law of the land, Steve Jobs would never have been able to act. He would have been hamstrung, since he would have to have approval from the different employee representatives, and it would have tied his hands, and that Apple would not have become the powerhouse it is today. Co-determination would make it less nimble. And another criticism that critics bring up, another argument in their favor, is they claim that in Germany, the statistics show that over half of German employees technically eligible for co-determination choose to opt out of it. And detractors claim that is proof that the pressures of globalization are pushing companies to adopt a more American model. And another argument they say is, co-determination can't be is oversold. They say Volkswagen has co-determination, and that didn't stop the emissions scandal from happening. And there was another scandal where the labor representatives on the board were offered prostitutes and favors by management in order to vote a certain way. So they're saying their argument in this case is that it's a bit oversold, that it would make companies more responsive to the public interest.
Another criticism. Co-determination would basically turn private corporations into public institutions. Is that really a bad thing?
That's a great question. Because one of our quotes from one of our people we interviewed from the article said that why if we have these people, public employee representatives on the board, why have a private corporation? And on the other hand, opponents say, look, it just reflects reality. It's not a bad thing, because large corporations are not like small mom and pops. They impact workers. Thousands of workers' lives. They impact communities, whether they're going to pollute or not. And that treating them as a semi-public institution is just facing reality. And I know there's Mr. Johnson, who's the head of the BET Black Entertainment Television, said he claimed that good companies always take into account their workers and communities anyway, and co-determination is unnecessary, and it's a slippery slope to socialism. But of course, supporters disagree very strongly, and that they say that they don't represent anything other than short-term interests, and this kind of structural change is needed.
And there's that argument that if you're working for a company and you're getting a little bit more of the pie, if you will, by having this participation in our corporate, you don't want to see this company fail. You don't want to see what happened to Apple. And besides, Apple was not a co-determination type of company when jobs came back, were they?
No, they weren't.
So it doesn't seem to me like it doesn't seem like it's a fair criticism.
No, what the critics are saying, they bring up the job example, the Apple and jobs example, saying if there had been co-determination at Apple in, say, 1996, if Apple had to have 40% of its board of directors elected by the employees, it would have hamstrung Steve Jobs' efforts to turn around the company and bust heads. Now, the argument you mentioned is brought up by co-determination supporters, saying the workers are going to want, since their livelihood depends on a healthy company, are going to be a little flexible. And they point to past examples of unions agreeing to less overtime, shorter hours, to let certain companies get back on their feet. So they're saying that argument is not cut and dry, that had there been employee representatives on Apple in the 1996, that it would have been a bad thing or it would have hamstrung anything.
Mm-hmm. Right. It would have been properly run. And there would not have been need for Steve Jobs to come in and tear everything apart. So, well, I guess this continues on. But before we let you go, is this really a politically viable idea?
Potentially, it is, because you look at public opinion polls. The latest one being a Civitas poll done, I think, in the 2018, and it shows that co-determination has more than 2-to-1 support among the public. Better than 2-to-1. It even has support from a good chunk of Republican-leaning voters. And the polls have been very consistent about this. Now, what's happening here with co-determination that Ms. Warren is pushing and the Green New Deal that Ms. Cortez is pushing is reminiscent of what happened, I think, in the late 70s. In the late 70s, Jack Kemp was kind of an intellectual powerhouse and had all the energy on the right. And he pushed for before Reagan was elected, like 78, 79, he pushed for big tax cuts and proposed legislation in the Democratic Congress. He knew it wasn't going to get anywhere. But he wanted to market it to the American people. He wanted to get it out there and get the arguments there so that when Reagan and the Republicans swept in, they would be further along and they would have their legislation aired to the public and ready to go. My opinion is that is exactly what's happening here. That Warren's bill is obviously not going to pass with the Republican Senate and Donald Trump. But if she puts it out there to the public and it's debated at least and people get familiar with the idea, it will be that much easier to enact into law if and when the Democrats come to power, say, win back the Senate and the presidency. I think the dynamics between what Warren and other Democratic leaders are doing now from the left is kind of eerily similar to what Kemp and the Republicans in the late 70s were doing on the right.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Very interesting, and we look forward to finding out more about that and what will happen come 2020. Glenn Daigon, journalist with the news site Who, What, Why, joining us today on America's Democrats podcast. Glenn, appreciate your time with us and look forward to hearing back from you soon.
Great. Thanks for having me, yeah.
You're quite welcome. Absolutely. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Hanna Trudo, national politics reporter at the National Journal.
Great pleasure to welcome to the studio to talk a little bit about the political scene 2020. Hanna Trudo from the National Journal and author of the OG 2020 newsletter. There it is. OG is Oh God?
Original.
Okay. Good to see you. How you doing?
Good to see you. I'm good, thanks.
Right. So there is a new poll out from Politico. Sorry to mention the competition this morning.
My former employer.
Is that right? All
yeah.
right. Yeah. Well, they're somehow limping along without you.
That's right.
And it's looking at the front runners for 2020, very early, of course, and most of this is name recognition. But let's start by talking about it because it shows Joe Biden, 33%. Bernie Sanders in second place, 15%. Kamala Harris, third place at 10%. And then Elizabeth Warren and, is that Beto?
Yeah, I think we were talking, Beto O'Rourke was like in the top 5.
Breaking the
No,
top
I'm
5.
sorry, it's Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker at 6%.
Oh, wow.
At
Okay.
6%. Yeah.
Tied at 6.
Tied at 6.
Okay.
Right, yeah. First of all, very interesting that Kamala Harris, it's been a week, right?
Yes.
Just about.
Yes.
And she pops up right behind Bernie and Joe Biden.
Yeah, I think she, of all the people who have announced yet, which admittedly there hasn't been too many official announcements, I think she was the one who received the biggest boost post-announcement. She announced that she was foregoing sort of the exploratory committee phase and just jumping in full force, and then hosted a big rally, which attracted, by my latest estimate, I think it was 20,000 people or upwards of that for her big rally, kickoff rally in Oakland. And, that was really well executed. She gave a really strong, powerful speech that I think people were waiting to see how she would roll out her campaign. She wasn't as active as other people in the midterms. She kind of, kept close to the home base in California and, didn't crisscross the country the way some of the other candidates did. And so I think there was a lot of anticipation, and I think she delivered on that.
Her rollout has been phenomenal.
Yeah.
I mean, for starting with Good Morning America, coming down here to Howard University, going down to South Carolina for the Sisterhood, and then the big rollout in Oakland, and then leading on to the town hall in Iowa.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Along the way, she picked up the endorsement of 2 members of Congress,
Yes.
Ted Lieu and Katie Hill, both from
California. Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, while that's maybe not surprising because they're from her same state, California is obviously, as you know, going to play a huge role in the election process. The primary has moved up earlier than it's ever been. There's a huge delegate haul there that she can, hopefully capture. So those early endorsements, I think, could help her.
Yeah, and she's the only candidate who's had any endorsements from Congress.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
All. Right.
Yeah, and speaking of California, I mean, I would sort of be remiss not to mention Eric Garcetti declining to run, which was just a couple days ago's news. And, I think that is sort of a symptom of seeing her sort of quick ascent to the higher levels of the polls and just the impressive rollout. He really did a lot in 2017 and 2018 to build the prep work for a potential political campaign.
Right.
But I think, in the end, just decided, look, I can't go up against Harris in my own state.
No, I think you're right. And I think Garcetti is a very attractive candidate. Has been a good mayor, good, strong mayor.
Yes.
And but people that I talked to in California, also having served as Democratic state chair of California at one time, were raising the question whether California could support 2 presidential candidates.
Right.
And I mean, she's certainly the stronger of the 2 and got out there earlier, and there's no way he could keep up with her.
I loved his statement. We played this on yesterday's show.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? Yeah. Garcetti 2040, I'd like to say that right now. In my deliberations, I realize that is the best time.
So, Hannah, I want you to go ahead and start your 2040 newsletter today. And Eric
can't
has to be
wait.
at the top of the list.
We're already talking 2024, so I'm ready.
Right. So he didn't rule himself completely out forever.
And he's like you said, he's a likable guy. I think he has a lot of allies. You know, he has a future ahead of him, and he could end up on a VP shortlist. You know,
and so
as he did last election.
So back to this Politico poll, Joe Biden. I mean, just about. I think he's the top at every poll, right? I mean, so if Joe and I think the latest is he keeps teasing, right? He's very close to making a decision. I don't think there's any doubt that he runs. If and when he jumps in, does he sort of preempt the field?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say because I think that he has been teasing a lot of people. You know, will he run? Will he not run? And I think yesterday or the other day, earlier this week, he said, "I'm not in any hurry to announce." Yeah. So we hear everything from "I'm very close" to "I'm not in any hurry." So and he does. You know, he's done this before. He's done this. You know, last election, and obviously he's run 2 times before. So I mean, of course, he would jump ahead in terms of name recognition. He has a lot of support among people who have just followed politics for decades. And of course, he's been in public service for many decades. But that being said, I think, you know, just reporting on this day in and day out, there's a lot of interest for newer, fresher faced candidates. So that's not to say he won't jump to the front of the pack. I'm sure he will because of all of the things that I just mentioned. But I don't think the race is necessarily his to claim the way sort of it was with Hillary last time.
Right. Who then ended up having what she didn't expect, a very surprising challenge from Bernie Sanders. Bernie is like Joe Biden, I think, one who can wait a little bit, but not too long. But when he jumps in, he also has a built-in support base. And organization and record.
And I think the thing that makes maybe even a stronger case for Bernie, which isn't highlighted as much, he has core supporters from last election that are likely to stay with him. Of course, some of them will break off and go to other candidates, but that core progressive base, there's not a lot of like hardcore progressive candidates with the same sort of bona fides that he brings and in a lot of his supporters' eyes. And so, of course, Elizabeth Warren, but a lot of people, like his track record on those issues. And with Biden, I think there's a lot of people who really like and support Biden, but could go to a Kamala Harris or a Cory Booker or Kirsten Gillibrand or Beto or whoever. So I think that's, a little bit underrated in terms of Biden's support. He kind of has people that love him, but could look elsewhere, whereas Bernie has a core group of supporters that I don't think are going to, scatter.
Who have been with him. Who have been. 2016, have been since, and...
And I think the big question is how much of that support is it? I mean, how great of a number is that? Is it enough to win him the nomination, or is it enough to...
Well, when you have 20 candidates...
That's right.
Doesn't take 50% to win the nomination.
Yeah.
Whether or not Bernie is the force this time around that he was in 2016, if he runs... which he's going to run.
He's going to run.
I think he absolutely has the highest floor of any other candidate in the race. I mean, he's gonna jump in with a large constituency already built in.
Yes.
Right. Which, by the way, Joe Biden does not have, not having run.
Right. And he, there's people who love him, but there's people who love new candidates as well, Right.
So we have 3 senators in so far, by my count. I think there are only 3: Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, and Kirsten Gillibrand. Right?
Yes.
There are. Well, we just mentioned Bernie. He's definitely another senator. We haven't heard from Amy Klobuchar, Cory Booker, or Sherrod Brown about when they might jump in. And then Jeff Merkley has also been talking about it. I think less likely to get in. But do you think we'll see those other 3, Booker, Brown, and Klobuchar?
I think for sure with Booker. I think he's made the most steps towards launching a campaign. He's really staffed up with some top people in a lot of the early voting states and battlegrounds. He's a very top requested surrogate and was in 2018 for a lot of the down ballot candidates. He's somebody that really inspires people to come out and see him and to come out and sort of listen to what he has to say. And I think when he does eventually announce, which is expected in the next, couple of weeks, I think he'll take away a little bit of the initial attention that Kamala Harris got, just because he'll be another, top tier senator. So he would be my next person. That being said, Sherrod Brown is on an interesting sort of listening tour of the country, so to speak, doing his Dignity of Work tour, it's called, talking about a lot of labor issues. And I think trying to make a little bit of a play at some of those Bernie supporters for whom labor was their top issue. He's going to be in New Hampshire in a couple of days. He'll be in, Iowa. He's making all of the top rounds. And then Amy Klobuchar, I'm a little bit more hesitant to say that she'll actually toss her name in, which has been, I think she's sort of less likely to do the politically expedient thing in terms of, launching into joining a pack of 20 people, and especially a lot of her Senate colleagues. I think she's a little bit more cautious and calculated, and a lot of her allies have told me over the past year or two, she really, really wants to run, but she's not just going to jump into something she doesn't think she can really have a shot at winning. And there's so many other women, and a lot of them are her own colleagues in the Senate. I think it's going to be, it's going to be interesting, but I wouldn't bet on her running.
It seems that Kamala Harris has sucked up a lot of oxygen out of the room, right? For an Amy Klobuchar particularly.
Right.
In fact, we haven't heard from Kirsten Gillibrand since she announced, right? I mean, she fell off the face of the earth after her announcement, whereas Kamala Harris keeps popping up everywhere.
I wouldn't discount Kirsten Gillibrand only because she actually does quite well in small town hall and group settings when she goes to these house parties in Iowa and in New Hampshire. I'm actually going to New Hampshire today to see her. She's speaking tomorrow at a series of events. And she's kind of more of a sleeper, dark horse candidate.
Dress warmly.
It's my home state.
You know what? Here's the thing. It's not fair, but my impression of New Hampshire, I've only been to New Hampshire during presidential primaries.
Yeah.
So I think of New Hampshire as ice and cold.
It gets really hot in the summer, though.
And that's not fair because I think it's a beautiful state. In the summer. To me, it is just the winter,
It gets, it's like 100 degrees in the summer and below zero in the winter. So, Yikes. But I would keep an eye on her just because, her core issue is this sort of women's candidate. So there are some, 50% of the voting population and growing.
But she's not the only woman out there.
She's not, So there's pluses and minuses for her.
Right. I just want to mention that maybe the kiss of death, but George Will, of all people, has a column today in the Washington Post praising Amy Klobuchar
interesting. Yeah.
As the Democrats' answer to
well, she gets a lot of bipartisan support.
She's great.
Yeah.
And you did mention along in passing Beto. Who knows what's in his mind, right?
Yeah.
To talk about a totally unorthodox approach.
Well, we've seen that before, I think. So, there's all these draft Beto movements trying to convince him to run, sort of doing the groundwork for him. I'm not sure if he's going to end up pulling the trigger in the end because he, like you said, it's very unorthodox. He hasn't built up a network of staff, a network of advisors he can rely on. He hasn't started courting donors, as far as I know. And he's just kind of doing his own thing right now. So I think we're just going to wait and see. If he does enter the race, I think it will be later. In the next, probably not before March.
And he figures he can do that, I guess.
I guess so, but I would just caution that the midterm momentum that he gained in 2018 can only last so long, and people kind of forget, and it's on to the really top tier presidential candidates.
And
so
by the way,
the
first debates among Democratic primary candidates will be in June. We don't have a date yet, I don't believe, or a place. But Tom Perez, the Democratic National Chair, has announced that, and they're trying to figure out. Because they'll have to they can't get them all on one stage. At one time there were 32 candidates. They're not going to be 32.
We talked about this with you, Hannah. At the end of last year, I think we got up to 33. We got up to.
And we've already seen people dropping out.
I forget now who it was.
Julian Castro. I think we forgot.
Yeah, we forgot.
Who's now
Castro.
a declared candidate.
Who's now in.
Yeah.
But, it's interesting because we did count, and not just us, but there was sort of widely speculated that there would be, 2 to 3 dozen candidates. But we've seen a sharp sort of cutting of the field over the past week or two. There's been almost a dozen people who we really thought were going to run, like Tom Steyer, Eric Garcetti, Michael Avenatti for a while we talked about.
Richard
Ojeda.
Andrew Cuomo.
Those
are
that's
five.
five.
That took themselves out. Right.
Yeah, no, and that's...
And there'll be others.
Yeah, I think Seth Moulton and Tim Ryan might not actually run in the end, and they're widely... thought to be. So there's a lot of surprises, just in the early rollout here. And that narrows the field a lot.
Elizabeth Warren, as you point out, a lot of people wanted her to run in 2016. Mm-hmm. I think from my conversations with Senator Sanders early on, that if she had run, he would not have run.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But she didn't, and he did.
Yeah.
So now she's coming back saying, okay, now I'm going to do it. And a lot of people, I think, resent the fact that she didn't run in 2016. That was her opportunity. And that she's, okay, you blew it, and so not going to work this time. And she's out there, though. She calls herself the nerd candidate, I think, right?
Yeah.
That's her approach, is just to talk substantive policy.
Yes.
She thinks that's what people are ready for.
I think she had an impressive rollout too. She kind of caught everybody by surprise doing it on New Year's Eve day, and I think that was really smart for her because it gave her a week of solid media attention to herself. And now, if Julian Castro announced he didn't quite get the same Kirsten Gillibrand, people are sort of scrambling and competing. Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana.
Oh, let's not forget him.
So now it's going to be a real race to when are you going to announce and how much media attention are you going to get to yourself for a sustained amount of time. And I think Warren really hit the sweet spot with about a week or a week and a half to herself. That being said, what you mentioned about the Sanders supporters kind of having that resentment, I think that's true. I think one of the early questions in following this was whether she would take a substantial amount of his supporters away from him, and then they would kind of divide up this very left-wing
I don't think so.
I don't think so, and she's actually actively courting more of the Hillary voters than the Bernie voters, from everything I've seen.
Speaking of Hillary, yesterday we did spend some time talking about Jeff Zeleny from CNN. Mm-hmm. His report that Hillary had told 3 people she had not closed the door on 2020, God forbid. This morning, John Podesta, her campaign manager, is reported as saying he's talked to her.
Yes.
She is not running.
Yes. And
good move.
I've talked to a source who is very close to her, very reliable source who talks to her regularly, who said she is not running, just so, to add my 2 cents of reporting's worth in that.
Very good. Thank you for adding. It would be nice to hear from her.
Right. Yeah.
She doesn't have to endorse anybody.
Yeah.
She shouldn't this early, but just say,
yeah.
By the way, some people have talked to me. I'm very gratified. I'm honored.
Right.
But I did my best.
Well, there's
no
no downside to having people talk about you. At least speculate that you're going to run, I guess.
Only just drives me crazy.
It's the Clintons. They're happy that anybody's talking about
That's
them.
right.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Okay, so then can't avoid it. There was one candidate I was sort of interested in. I wanted to hear what he had to say. I thought he would bring a totally different perspective to the Democratic primary as a successful businessman and with his practical
I was wondering who you were
ideas.
talking about for a second.
Lifelong Democrat.
Lifelong Democrat.
Yes.
And then what the hell? Howard Schultz now is just basically running as an anti-Democrat.
Right. Yeah, I think Howard Schultz is really making a lot of people very upset right now, to put it diplomatically.
Yeah.
I think he's not... he's angered people that sort of would have welcomed him in an open primary as a billionaire. He brings something unique to the table. Certainly, if Tom Steyer, who is also a billionaire, didn't run, he could be the billionaire candidate. Now, is that good in a Democratic primary? Who knows? But he has a different perspective, and now I think this independent looks like he's going to really take a stab at this independent run. I think it's really infuriating. A lot of people, not just sort of establishment type of Democrats in the party, but just regular people are saying, what are you doing? You're going to make Trump win, and that that remains to be seen. But that's the sentiment out there.
But it is true. I mean, look, I think in the end he would not have gotten my vote because he has said some things which don't represent my
right
policy objectives like cutting Social Security, cutting Medicare. He's against a graduated increased tax on the very, very wealthiest people like him.
Mm-hmm.
But still, I think his voice in the Democratic primary would have been welcome.
Yeah.
And he would get out there and, like everybody else, throw their ideas out and let the voters decide. Instead, he has said, I'm going to go on a totally different path, which we have seen is impossible, where it's impossible to win, and all you can do is screw things up and take votes away from the front runner and elect somebody like re-elect Donald Trump.
Right, and I think it's interesting just in contrast to somebody like Bloomberg, who is also a billionaire, who changed his party affiliation from Republican to Democrat just to compete in the primary. So I don't know if that will win Bloomberg any brownie points among fellow Dems, for doing that and saying, look, he was willing to compete with everybody else, why aren't you? But I think it's an interesting contrast.
Right. I mean, Bloomberg has said, I'm going to run as a Democrat, and it's insane to run as an independent.
Right.
He spent a lot of money in 2016 looking at the possibility of running. But you know who else did as an independent? So did Donald Trump.
Right.
Remember?
Yeah.
Donald Trump came to the same conclusion.
Yeah.
You can't win.
Yeah,
like it or not, and I don't love it. I mean, like it or not, it's a two-party system.
You're right. And we've talked about that. I would love to see a viable third party.
Sure.
But the system today is rigged against an independent
Yes.
candidate.
Yeah. Yeah.
In terms of
that's true.
ability to get on the ballots, being part of the debates, and being part of the, having your opportunity to get the word out there. It's really rigged against you.
Yeah, and I think the other part of it with him specifically is with Democrats, they feel the stakes are so high, right now that this isn't necessarily the time to experiment with a third party run when it's Trump, and that's their sort of ultimate goal is I don't care who the nominee is as long as they can beat Trump. A lot of people say that. And so I think maybe that people would have been open to a third party candidate if regular people, if it were, a somewhat benign type of Republican in their eyes. But when it's Trump and it's an all high stakes, matchup, I think that's kind of escalated the anger.
All right. So if we have a list of those who are left, we're still probably talking about as many as 15 to 20 Democratic candidates who could jump in. How long is your list of challengers to Donald Trump in the Republican primary?
Well, Jeff Flake said he's out, so he's not going to run.
Big surprise.
Yeah. I think the Kavanaugh vote may have sealed the deal for him on that. But the challenger list for Donald Trump is not very long. I don't think it's going to be successful if somebody tries to really mount some type of challenge against him.
By the way, I saw last night Chris Christie, who's out on a book tour, did not rule out that he would run against Donald Trump. He left the door open a little bit.
Chris Christie has left it open. I think Mitt Romney has left it open. Obviously, John Kasich has left it open. But I think, a lot of these people have
just
run.
Took a job with CNN.
Right.
So he's on the sidelines for a year.
Yeah. And
Chris Christie would be very interesting because
they have such a crazy relationship.
Yeah. Donald Trump accused him in the bridge game of selling out. I mean, during the whole, he said Chris Christie lied. And then Christie turned around and wasn't he the first one of the first ones to endorse Trump?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And has met with him about different cabinet positions that have opened up.
Well, a month ago, he met with him about being the new chief of staff.
That's right. Yeah. So that's an interesting. I mean, the thing is,
by the way, I would love to see that, but I mean, Christie would have some explaining to do about. I mean, I remember that. In the primary, we used to always laugh about Chris Christie would be standing in back of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The hostage.
Yeah, the hostage.
Yeah.
That's right. I completely forgot about it.
Yeah, me too. God, it seems like forever ago.
That's what we called him at the time. Yeah, he looked like the hostage.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also important to remember Kasich and Christie ran against Trump before and were unsuccessful.
Yes.
So, I mean, even if they do, I mean, things have changed and stuff, but I would just caution them because they've run against him and didn't end up
what you're
well.
saying is he'll have a free ride. Nobody's going to run against him.
I think people might try and feel that it's not working. That's I don't cover the Republicans as closely, but that's my kind of instinct to say that.
I'm very upset that we didn't get into Larry Hogan.
Larry Hogan's being talked about too.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, no. That's where we are.
Right. Right.
It's so exhausted the field.
Yeah.
Nikki
so
Haley
far,
said she's not going to do it.
Nikki Haley would be a great
She would be an
challenger.
interesting person.
Right.
Yeah, a very stark
Larry Hogan,
contrast.
I don't think so, Peter, with all apologies. I know you live in Maryland now, but...
But I think it's like, who is a stark contrast from Trump? I mean, Chris Christie has a lot of the same kind of tendencies and mannerisms as Trump with his bombast. And, John Kasich ran against him very unsuccessfully. I think Nikki Haley would be a really interesting person to take him on, but she's categorically ruled it out. So for now, at least for this cycle. So
Steve Bannon.
Wow.
Steve Bannon.
There was a
campaign.
rumor about Steve Bannon running for president.
I hadn't
this
seen
time,
that.
but this was a while back.
You must have missed that one.
Well, it did start too early, Anna, but at least that's good for you, right?
Yeah, it's been great.
More material for the newsletter. And
That's right.
There's been no lack of material.
No,
for the
there
newsletter
hasn't.
On the
There
presidential
hasn't.
front, yeah. You're going to be tired of it, though.
I love it.
A year from now, 18 months from now, you're saying, get it over with. Man. And you're right. Then we'll start talking about 2024.
Oh, my gosh.
Nonstop. Hanna Trudo
Crazy.
from the National Journal, nationaljournal.com.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Julie Kerr, Glenn Daigon, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.